In the late 15th century, Leonardo da Vinci animated the inside of a church refectory with a heated and passionate psychological drama.
Hello everyone, welcome back to About Art. Today we are in Milan, the fashion city of Italy, and we're going to be looking at a work of art that is so famous, I'm already getting goosebumps. Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper is located inside the refectory of this church, La Chiesa di Santa Maria della Grazie. Upon its completion in 1498, Leonardo's painting astounded its audiences, and today it is considered to be one of the greatest works of art ever to exist. What is it about his painting that is so striking and so timeless? Well, let's go and find out.
Here it is. 13 life-size portraits that are shown gathered around a long table and engaged in a moment of drama. What has just happened? Well, let's start from the very beginning. A little while after arriving in Milan from Florence, with the aim of making a name for himself, Leonardo da Vinci was commissioned to execute this monumental mural. This was an incredibly important opportunity for Leonardo. Up until that point, he had not produced any major commissions, and he certainly had no experience in executing frescoes. This was his chance to show the world who he was. The work of art depicts the biblical event in which Christ and his apostles have one final supper together before his crucifixion. This biblical event was an extremely popular subject in the Italian Renaissance, and it was often commissioned to be painted in a church refectory where the monks would gather and eat. The subject was considered as an apt, thought-provoking and prayer-inducing backdrop to the monks' daily meals.
Now, this work of art has been tormented by a number of conspiracy theories and hypotheses. For example, the Italian musician Giovanni Palla believed that Leonardo incorporated musical notes into this painting. Now, I personally steer clear of all these theories. What is undeniable, however, is that with this painting, Leonardo was doing something new.
First of all, Leonardo was pioneering new techniques and methods of representation. Leonardo da Vinci has depicted the figures in an interior space that feels spatially real. He has created a sense of three-dimensionality and depth through a novel technique that had only recently been discovered by the Italian architect Filippo Brunelleschi a few years prior: linear perspective. As you can see, the coffers of the ceiling form receding diagonal lines, also known as orthogonals, that converge upon a single vanishing point. In order to render this extremely accurate and perspectival illusion, Leonardo da Vinci hammered a nail into the wall directly above Christ's temple, attached a string to it, and then used that string to mark out the receding diagonals and angles he knew would suggest depth. For a 15th century audience who were only familiar with two-dimensional renditions such as this was astounding. What it does is it allows the viewer to step into the scene. The monks who used to eat before this painting no doubt saw it as an open window into another tangible world that extended beyond the flat wall on which it was painted. Secondly, Leonardo made a significant departure from how Last Suppers had previously been rendered in Western art. Previously, Christ had typically been shown in the act of breaking the bread, and thus establishing the Eucharist. Leonardo, on the other hand, has chosen to depict the very moment after which Christ declares that one of the men in the room will betray him. What we see are all 12 of his apostles reacting differently to the shocking news. In other words, the dramatic climax. On the right, Matthew, Thaddeus and Simon look infinitely confused. They seem to be looking to each other for answers. To the left, Bartholomew, James Celeste and Andrew all seem to be in complete shock and disbelief. Further down, Peter looks angry and he seems to be rushing in to protect and defend Christ. John, on the other hand, appears to resign in distress and sorrow. To the right of Christ, James the Greater extends his arms in anger, while Philip brings his arms inwards in concern. In line with the Gospel, he seems to be saying, "Will it be me?" We are witnessing a full spectrum of human emotions: confusion, sorrow, surprise, concern, denial. So Leonardo da Vinci is not only giving us a precise rendition of three-dimensionality, spatial illusion and geometry, but emotional and psychological drama.
Now, what I particularly love about this painting is that Da Vinci not only uses expressions to communicate certain feelings, but in true Italian fashion, he also uses hands.
These are all incredibly expressive gestures which communicate exactly what each of the apostles are feeling. The gestures and poses also reflect humanity itself. As Leonardo himself stated, in order to give your figures a pleasing air, you should look about you. These gestures are the magic behind this painting. For the first time, these biblical characters are being animated with gestures and expressions that feel very real, very present, and very familiar. And in the very center of it all, Christ represents calm composure in the midst of the storm. His upper torso forms a stable and steady triangle, making him the emotional grounding of the scene. This is also echoed in the objects displayed on the table. Those before the apostles appear disorderly, while those in front of Christ are noticeably more ordered. With tranquility and solemnity, his open arms gesture subtly to the wine and bread before him, the symbols of his imminent sacrifice. Let's talk about Judas, who, as we know, is the imminent betrayer, and Leonardo portrays this fact brilliantly. Upon hearing the news, Judas reclines dramatically, his upper body forming an inverted triangle with Christ. So he separates himself from Christ, and yet at the same time, they are very closely connected by the fact that they both reach towards the bowl on the table, which is exactly how Christ identifies his betrayer. He that dippeth his hand with me in the dish, the same shall betray me. Previously, artists had chosen to depict Judas as separate from the group, but I think that Leonardo's rendering is very significant. By placing Christ and Judas next to each other, he succeeds in heightening the betrayal. And there are other clues that point towards Judas's impending action. Unlike the other figures, his face is cast in shadow. And he is shown clutching a bag of money. In other words, the 30 pieces of silver he is paid by the Romans to betray Christ. These subtle details hint towards the impending future, and we can see something similar with Thomas to the right of Christ. He is shown pointing upwards as if to say, is this part of God's plan? But it also foreshadows when he uses this very same finger to poke at Christ's wounds after his resurrection. In addition, Peter holds a knife in his right hand, which foreshadows his impending attack a few hours later on one of the men that arrests Christ. So even though this painting depicts a momentary second, Leonardo has also managed to hint towards future events. Christ is also strategically framed by the blue sky that is visible through the 3 windows. This endows him with a sense of divinity, without Leonardo having to resort to depicting halos. Leonardo is being very clever and subtle in his use of symbolism. Notice how the apostles are organized in groups of 3. This is not only a compositional grouping, it could also be a subtle hint towards the Holy Trinity. So as a true humanist, Leonardo da Vinci is placing the focus on human interaction without compromising or downplaying the religious significance of the scene.
Now we have to address the elephant in the room, which is that today most of the details and expressions of this painting are not visible. This is a highly damaged mural.
Instead of executing a traditional fresco, which involves painting on wet plaster walls, Leonardo da Vinci painted with experimental pigments directly on the dry plaster wall because he wanted to achieve a greater sense of tonal gradation than was possible with traditional fresco painting. Unfortunately, the paint did not adhere too well, and it began to flake away a few years after the work was finished. We know this from a number of written sources. For example, in 1517, upon seeing the Last Supper, the secretary of an influential cardinal, Antonio de Beatis, wrote, "It is most excellent, although it is beginning to decay, either because of the dampness of the wall or some other form of neglect." Over the next 100 years, the work of art continued to worsen as it was adjoining a kitchen which caused moisture to get trapped in the wall. It has been speculated that today, roughly only 30% or less of the original remains, and yet it is still so captivating. We can only imagine what Da Vinci's original rendition would have looked like. Luckily, there are a few copies of the original that exist, and which may give us a better sense of what was once visible on this wall. 3 copies were made in the 16th century by several of Leonardo's students who were operating in his workshop. In around 1520, Giampietrino made a copy which is now in London's Royal Academy of Arts. Another copy, made at around the same time, is largely attributed to Andrea Solari and is now in the Leonardo da Vinci Museum in Belgium. A third copy, made in around 1550 and attributed to Cesare da Sesto, is now in the Church of Sant'Ambrogio in Switzerland. These artists probably had access to Leonardo's cartoons, and they may even have picked or traced part of them, and that means that they give us a very good sense of what once existed on this wall. They hint towards the intensity of color and clarity of facial expressions that were once visible on this wall. But even so, we will never truly know exactly what Da Vinci's original rendition looked like.
So Leonardo's ambition had its price to pay, and this painting can essentially be described as a failed experiment. But it did succeed in many other aspects.
For one, it succeeded in connecting with the viewer. Even despite its fragmented state, we are still able to recognize the gestures and the emotions being depicted in this scene. Just imagine the full impact of this painted scene when it was once in pristine condition. Leonardo painted an emotional, intimate, and dramatic interaction that coaxed the figures out of their biblical narrative and also allowed them to stand as mere humans, erupting with emotion. In my opinion, this universal depiction of feeling is what makes this painting, and art in general, so striking. In addition, for me, this painting's damaged state is a gentle reminder that, more often than not, and despite our efforts to do so, the past is not fully retrievable, and that only makes it all the more special.
Alright everyone, that brings us to the end of today's vlog on Da Vinci's Last Supper. I really recommend seeing this work of art in person. Today was my first time seeing it in person, and despite its fragmented state, it truly did take my breath away. Let me know your thoughts and questions in the comment section down below, as well as what work of art you would love to see from me next. And finally, if you enjoyed today's video, please do give it a big like, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel for much more content. Thank you ever so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.